Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. It was the kind of call you always expect to be a telemarketer or someone trying to sell you insurance, but this time it was different. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number flashing in bold, black letters. The area code was unfamiliar, and yet something in the pit of my stomach tightened. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I didn't recognize the number, but for some reason it felt important. Almost urgent. I hesitated, then answered. Hello, I spoke into the phone, my voice betraying a faint sense of unease. For a moment there was nothing but the usual dead air, a pause that almost seemed too long, as though someone was trying to gauge whether I would hang up. Then the voice came through, quiet but distinct. My heart skipped a beat. It was soft, soothing, but there was something unmistakable about it, something I couldn't place, but something that gnawed at me. Do you remember me? The voice asked. I froze. It was a voice I knew, I was certain of it. Yet I couldn't remember where from. The words were so casual, as if we had just seen each other yesterday, as if it was someone I should have recognized, and yet my mind refused to connect the dots. Who is this? I asked, my tone a little sharper now, but still unsure, my voice betraying my confusion. There was a chuckle, soft, almost mocking. You really don't remember. That's strange. You were always so good at remembering. My throat tightened, my pulse quickening. Something about this call didn't feel right. The voice seemed to linger in the air, its echo bouncing around my skull, refusing to leave. I began, my words faltering. But the voice didn't let me finish. It continued, its tone now growing more familiar, but still, I couldn't place it. It's been a long time, hasn't it? You must have forgotten, but I haven't. I'll remind you. A shiver ran down my spine as the voice drifted through the line like smoke. I could feel the connection now, a deep, unsettling pull, like a thread between us that I didn't remember ever being there. The voice wasn't just familiar, it felt intimate, as if it had been with me longer than I'd been aware of. Why are you calling me? I demanded, gripping the phone tighter, trying to anchor myself to reality. My fingers were growing cold, sweat slicking across my palms. I just wanted to know if you're still listening, the voice said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. And in the way it was said, it felt like something more. I felt my pulse race as the voice seemed to fade, as if it was stepping away, but not entirely. I strained to hear, but only the faint hum of the line remained. The voice had slipped back into the silence, leaving me with nothing but that horrible sense of recognition, the one that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Before I could process anything more, the line went dead. The call was over. The phone screen blinked back to the usual home screen, but I could still feel the tension in the air, like the phone call had never truly ended. Like it was still hanging there in the space between us. I stared at the phone for a long time, my thoughts racing. That voice, I knew it. I had to know it. But I couldn't remember where I'd heard it, or who it belonged to. The apartment around me felt suddenly too quiet, too still. My chest tightened as I stood frozen, staring at the phone. The world outside my window seemed distant, muffled. It was as if the call had drained the noise from everything, leaving me in a vacuum of eerie silence. The feeling of being watched crept over me again, an old fear that I thought I had long outgrown. I felt it in the pit of my stomach. Someone or something was out there. Waiting, watching. I paced back and forth, trying to shake the unease. My thoughts were a jumble. I had to focus. I had to figure out who was behind the call. I couldn't let this go, not when it felt like it was pulling me back into something from my past, something I couldn't quite reach. I tried dialing the number back. The screen flashed and the call went straight to voicemail. I stared at the message icon that blinked up at me, that same cold, indifferent icon that seemed to mock me. A voicemail from the same number. I pressed play. It was the same voice again, calm and measured. I told you I'd remind you. It's time you remembered. I dropped the phone, feeling it slip from my fingers as a wave of nausea hit me. The voice. It was so familiar, and yet it shouldn't have been. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it somewhere deep inside. And I had a horrible feeling that I had always known. I couldn't stop replaying the voicemail in my head over and over. It's time you remembered. The words echoed in my mind, a broken record that refused to stop spinning. I had to know who was behind this, who was calling me, and why they sounded so damn familiar. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't place the voice. It was as if it belonged to someone from another lifetime, someone who no longer existed in my present. I grabbed my phone again, trying to focus, trying to calm the storm inside my head. But my fingers were trembling and the screen flickered as though mocking me. The unknown number flashed again on the display. My stomach clenched at the sight. For a moment I considered ignoring it, just turning the damn thing off and pretending it never happened. But something inside me screamed that I couldn't. I had to answer. Maybe, just maybe, this time I'd get some answers. I pressed accept, taking a deep breath before bringing the phone to my ear. My pulse thudded in my temples. Hello, my voice was barely above a whisper, my words trembling. There was the familiar silence on the other end, a pause that seemed to stretch on forever. Then came the voice again, calm, soft, and as unsettling as the first time. You still don't remember, do you? It was like a needle digging deeper into a wound I didn't know I had. My skin tingled with unease, my heart hammering in my chest. Why, I don't know what you're talking about, I stammered, my throat dry. I tried to steady my breath, but it was no use. The air around me felt heavy, thick with tension. Who is this? What do you want from me? The voice didn't answer my question. Instead, it asked something else, something that hit me like a punch to the gut. Do you remember the last time we spoke? The voice lowered, dropping to a whisper as if it was sharing a secret. It was before everything fell apart, wasn't it? My stomach dropped. The words stirred something deep inside of me, a sensation that was too familiar, like déjà vu that wasn't quite right. Why, I began, but the voice cut me off, this time sharper. Think harder. You can't forget me. Not after everything we've been through. My mind raced, trying to piece together fragments, but it was like trying to grab smoke with my bare hands. I had no memory of this person. None. But that feeling, that sense of familiarity, gnawed at me like a phantom ache. "I'm not who you think I am," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I don't know you. I've never heard you before." The voice let out a low chuckle, as though it was amused by my confusion. "That's what you always say, isn't it? You keep telling yourself you've forgotten. You really think you can outrun the past." I felt a chill sweep through me. My skin prickled as I looked around the room. It was the same as always, the same empty walls, the same dim light coming through the window. But now it felt different. It felt wrong. The silence in the room grew louder, pressing against me as if something was closing in. "Who is this?" I asked again, my voice louder this time. "Tell me who you are." The voice didn't answer. Instead, there was a shift, something subtle but unmistakable. A sound, faint but distinct, came through the line. A rustling like fabric brushing against skin. And then more clearly the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the quiet. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were too real. "Too close." "I told you," the voice said again, but this time it was different. It was colder, sharper. "You should have remembered. Now it's too late." My grip tightened on the phone. I couldn't breathe. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. No one in the room with me. The footsteps continued, but they weren't coming from the phone anymore. They were coming from behind me. I could hear them, the soft scuff of shoes on carpet, slow and deliberate. I turned around quickly, my eyes scanning the empty apartment. The walls seemed to close in on me, the familiar space now foreign, hostile. Nothing was there. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. "Stop it," I whispered to myself. "Stop it. You're imagining it." But deep down I knew. I wasn't imagining it. The call, the voice, the footsteps. They weren't just in my head. Someone was out there, pulling at the threads of my sanity. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the phone vibrated in my hand again. Another call. The same unknown number. I couldn't answer this time. I didn't know if I could handle another round of whatever this was. The footsteps, the voice. It was all too real. My mind couldn't keep up with the twisting, turning puzzle. I let the phone ring out, the vibrations echoing in my palm. But as I stared at the screen, something else caught my attention. There was a message notification. I tapped it without thinking, my eyes scanning the text that appeared. "Don't forget to look behind you." The words hit me like a hammer. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall, dark, and impossibly still. My blood ran cold. I didn't need to see their face. I knew who it was. The thread was unraveling, and I couldn't stop it. The figure in the doorway didn't move. It was as if it were a shadow, a part of the room, but somehow. Not. My breath hitched and I froze, staring at it, the air in the room suddenly becoming thick and suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but my feet were rooted to the floor as if my body had betrayed me. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the figure, though clearly there, seemed almost to fade in and out of focus. I couldn't make out any real details, just a vague outline, dark against the dim light of the hallway. The longer I stared, the more it felt like the figure was stretching, its edges blurring, becoming something that didn't belong in the space I knew. I heard the soft click of the phone on the table beside me, the call still going, though it no longer mattered. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in the doorway. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice a mere rasp. There was no response, only an overwhelming silence, a silence that stretched longer than felt possible. Then the figure shifted. Its head tilted slightly, and in that small movement, I saw the glint of something metallic in its hand. The sudden realization hit me like a slap. It wasn't just standing there. It was holding something. A phone. A chill ran down my spine and my mouth went dry. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts scattered, spinning in chaotic circles. The connection, the call, the voice. It was all coming together in a way I couldn't quite understand, but I was beginning to feel that it was much more than just a prank or a sick joke. I took a step back and the figure did the same, mirroring my movement in perfect synchronization. No sound, no shift of clothing, no creak of the floorboards beneath its feet, just that eerie, unnatural stillness. The phone call buzzed again, an interruption that seemed almost mocking. It was as if it were daring me to pick it up, to accept the next phase of whatever nightmare this was. But the truth was more terrifying than the idea of picking it up. It was more terrifying than the figure, the footsteps, or the voice. The truth was that I knew the person on the other end of the line. I felt it in my bones. My eyes flicked to the screen of my phone, still lighting up with notifications. A new message came through. "Do you remember now?" I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth as I read the message. A sickening nausea surged through me, and I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in the process. The phone slipped from my grip and fell to the floor, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the doorway. The figure in the hallway stood motionless, the only movement the subtle rise and fall of its chest. It was as if time had slowed to a crawl, every second stretching unbearably long. I didn't know what to do. I had no control over what was happening. All I could think about was the message, the voice on the phone, and the sudden, cold realization that it was all connected. Suddenly the phone buzzed again, much louder this time, breaking the oppressive silence like an alarm going off in my head. I scrambled to pick it up, desperate to understand what was happening. But before I could answer, the figure in the doorway spoke. "Well, answer it." The voice wasn't the same as the one on the phone. It was deeper, smoother, almost familiar, but still. "Wrong." It made my stomach churn. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure stepped forward slowly, its footfalls soundless on the carpet. It was close now, closer than I realized. My pulse hammered in my chest, my thoughts a blur. The figure was only a few feet away. I could see the outline of its face, but the details were too blurry, too indistinct, like a figure in a fog. It wasn't fully there, yet it was. "Pick it up," the figure repeated, its voice now cold and commanding. The air around me seemed to hum, like a deep, unsettling vibration that I could feel in my bones. I reached for the phone, hands trembling, my fingers barely able to grip the device. When I brought it to my ear, the world around me seemed to shift, like a quick, sharp tilt, and I had to fight to keep myself from collapsing. The same voice answered. "Finally, you're listening." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, the words caught. I wanted to ask who it was, to demand an explanation, but nothing came out. The figure in front of me smiled, if you could call it that. Its lips curled upward, but the smile didn't reach its eyes. Those eyes, those dark, empty eyes, stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You've forgot. It's all gone, isn't it?" The voice on the phone chuckled softly, almost pityingly. "You were supposed to remember, but you ran. You always run." I gripped the phone tighter, the plastic cutting into my skin. "What do you want from me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You can't hide from this," the figure in the doorway said. "You've been running from the truth for too long." Suddenly the phone went dead. The silence was deafening. I looked up in time to see the figure take another step forward, now standing directly in front of me. It towered over me, its presence suffocating. I didn't know what to do anymore. The phone call, the messages, the figure, it was all too much. The truth was something I didn't want to face, something I couldn't even begin to understand. But I knew deep down that this was just the beginning. Whatever was happening, whatever connection I had to this unknown figure, it was only going to get worse. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The phone slipped from my hand again, clattering to the floor, its screen flickering. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now, the air thick with something that felt like impending doom. The figure in front of me didn't move, it simply stood there, towering, watching me. The chill in the room seemed to deepen with each passing second, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on me, suffocating every rational thought I had left. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't respond. The face, the facelessness of the figure was what kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if the air around it had become too dense, too heavy to breathe, and the closer it got, the harder it was to think clearly. Then, as if to break the tension, the phone buzzed again. I jumped, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. I hesitated, my eyes flicking to the fallen phone, its screen still dimly lit. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to hear that voice again. But I was compelled. Like a moth to a flame, I reached for the phone, my fingers cold and clammy. The moment my hand wrapped around the phone, I heard it, soft, almost a whisper at first, but unmistakable. "You're not getting away." I froze, my grip tightening on the phone as the voice from the other side of the line cut through the silence. It wasn't just the voice from the previous call. No, this was different. It felt closer, more real. I felt a tingling sensation creep up my spine as I lifted the phone to my ear, my breath shallow. "Who are you?" My voice sounded small, barely audible, but the words escaped before I could stop them. There was a pause on the other end. For a moment, all I could hear was the soft hum of static, and then, "You know who I am." The words were spoken in a calm, almost reassuring tone, but the underlying malice was unmistakable. The voice was cold, familiar, and yet I couldn't place it. Every instinct told me I had heard it before, but where? "When? Please," I whispered, my throat tight with panic. "Please just tell me what you want." A low chuckle echoed from the phone, causing my pulse to spike. It wasn't a comforting sound, but rather a twisted, almost mocking laugh that seemed to reverberate within me, curling itself around my thoughts. "You've been running for so long, haven't you?" The voice continued, each word deliberate, laced with something I couldn't name. "Do you even remember why?" I shook my head, my grip on the phone trembling. It felt as though the walls of the room were closing in, the space becoming smaller and smaller with each breath I took. I glanced back up at the figure in the doorway. It was still there, motionless, its presence unyielding and oppressive. I didn't understand. The voice on the phone, the figure standing there. They were connected. But how? And why was I so afraid? The phone crackled again, and then, for the first time, the voice spoke in a tone I almost recognized. "You remember that night, don't you?" it asked softly. I felt a chill sweep through me. My heart stopped for a moment, and everything else in the room seemed to fade away. That night I'd been trying to forget for so long. The memory was there, just out of reach, slipping through my fingers every time I tried to grasp it. The failing, the horror of it. I could almost see it, but the details remained blurred, elusive. "What night?" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper now. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, there was a soft shuffling sound from the doorway. I turned back to the figure, my breath catching in my throat as I realized it was moving, slowly inching closer. My body screamed to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away from its looming presence. And then the voice on the phone broke through the silence again. "You really don't remember, do you? You thought you could forget." The voice was almost gentle now, as though it were speaking to a child. "But some things can never be erased." I felt the air shift as the figure took another step toward me, the room growing colder with each movement. My chest tightened, the panic building up in my chest, suffocating me. I knew I had to do something. I had to stop it. But I was paralyzed, helpless. The phone buzzed again, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. "You're not alone anymore," the voice on the phone said, a dark promise in its tone. "You'll never be alone again." The figure was so close now, I could feel its presence like a shadow over me. I could see it more clearly now, its shape, the dark outline against the faint light from the hallway. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something more. Real. Something far more sinister. But its face remained a blur, a shifting mass of darkness. Suddenly a sharp, eerie whisper cut through the room, and I felt my stomach drop. It was like 1,000 voices speaking at once, low and unintelligible, their words merging into a single, chilling sound. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel the malice in every syllable. The phone shook in my hand, and I glanced at the screen again, praying for some sign that this was just a dream, that I could wake up. But there was no escape. The message on the screen was clear, and it was as terrifying as everything else that had happened. Look behind you. My heart stopped. I didn't want to look. I couldn't. The words on the screen burned themselves into my mind, their message clearer than anything I'd ever read before. Look behind you. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure in the doorway was too close now, so close that I could feel its cold presence creeping over me like a blanket of darkness. I couldn't hear my own breath anymore, couldn't feel the steady thump of my heart. Everything had become muffled, as if I were underwater. The phone trembled in my hand, a slow, mechanical buzz vibrating through my fingers, and then it went silent. The connection was gone. My entire body was shaking, but the stillness that followed was worse than anything I had felt before. The silence was deafening. The figure stood there, its features still indistinguishable. The shadow stretched long across the floor, pooling at my feet, as if it were consuming the light around it. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something about its movement, or rather the lack of movement, paralyzed me. It wasn't just the figure. It was everything: the weight of the room, the suffocating air, the growing sense of unease that threatened to swallow me whole. I had to look. I had to. I wasn't going to survive this if I didn't face whatever it was. I slowly turned my head, my neck stiff, as if the simple act of moving would somehow summon the darkness. The room was eerily quiet now. I could hear the faintest sound of my breath, shallow and uneven, but nothing else. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I shifted, inching my gaze over my shoulder, dreading what I might see. At first I saw nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out behind me, as still and lifeless as the rest of the house. No footsteps, no shadows moving. But there was something about the stillness that felt wrong. I could feel the weight of the air, the tension crawling up my spine like 1,000 tiny insects. And then I saw it. The reflection. The hallway was not as empty as it seemed. There, standing just beyond the corner, was a figure. A person. But they weren't moving. They were waiting. My heart lurched and I turned back to face the doorway. The figure was gone. Vanished. In its place there was only the faint outline of a shadow, stretching like fingers toward me. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and the thought of looking back toward the hallway was unbearable. But I had already seen it. The reflection was still there, lingering in the corner of my mind, and I couldn't forget it. I backed away from the doorway, my feet stumbling over the floor as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it real? Or was I losing my grip on reality? The phone buzzed again, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. I grabbed it, nearly dropping it in the process. But this time there was no voice on the other end. Just static. Cold, harsh static that filled the room, seeping into my skull. I held the phone to my ear, praying for something, anything, familiar. But there was only the crackling noise. The static grew louder, more insistent, until it became a maddening, high-pitched screech. I slammed the phone down on the table, my hands trembling violently. It was too much. I couldn't think straight. And then a whisper, a faint, cold breath of air, breathed across my ear. I told you to look. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The figure from the hallway, the reflection, it was now standing right in front of me. The darkness clung to it like a shroud, its face a shadow I couldn't quite make out, but I could feel it watching me. It didn't speak again, but the tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the sound so loud it nearly drowned out everything else. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow, expanding like an inescapable force, wrapping itself around me. I had to get out. There was no other choice. My body was trembling so badly that I could barely stand, but somehow I forced myself to move, one slow step at a time. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was always there, hovering just at the edge of my vision, no matter where I looked. My mind was racing. What was this thing? Was it real? Was it my imagination? The house, my home, had become a prison. Every corner felt like a trap, every shadow a threat. The walls seemed to close in on me, pressing on my chest with an unbearable weight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I stumbled back toward the door, my fingers desperately searching for the handle. It wouldn't open. The lock was jammed. The door wouldn't budge. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. It was as if the very air itself had swallowed my voice. Behind me, the figure moved, a slow, deliberate step forward. My head whipped around, my breath ragged as I looked into the eyes of the shadow. It was closer now, almost within reach. I could see it, its features were becoming clearer, but there was something wrong. Too much darkness, too much emptiness. Suddenly the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder. The walls began to bend, to warp. The floor beneath me trembled as if the house itself were alive. And then the whispering began. Quiet at first, but growing louder, each voice more urgent, more desperate than the last. They were all around me, their words blending together into an incomprehensible murmur. I could barely make out one word. One name. Run. It was my name. And then everything went black. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. The sound of tires on gravel echoed in the emptiness. The rhythmic crunch of my car's wheels against the parking lot felt oddly louder in the dead of night. The streetlights above flickered intermittently, casting long, jittery shadows over the rows of parked vehicles. It wasn't a place I should have been, not at this hour. The city was quiet, too quiet, and something about the atmosphere made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled into a space at the far end of the lot, far from the main street, where the parking lot stretched into an abyss of darkness. The stillness was suffocating, and the air felt thick, as if something were waiting. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel. The parking lot wasn't unfamiliar to me. I had parked here countless times before, on late nights after long shifts, or when I couldn't sleep. But tonight was different. Tonight, a sense of unease gnawed at me, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. I glanced around. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars scattered here and there. The distant hum of the city felt muffled, almost drowned out by the emptiness surrounding me. The parking lot felt like a void, a hollow space where time itself had forgotten to tick. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and old rubber, but there was something else too, a strange, acrid scent that seemed to linger in the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe. I rolled down the window, trying to clear my head, but the smell only intensified. And then I saw it. A figure. It was standing between two cars, just a silhouette in the dim light. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone who had stayed behind late at work or was cutting through the lot to get somewhere. But as I stared, something felt wrong. The figure was still, almost unnervingly so. It didn't move, didn't sway in the breeze, nothing. Just standing there. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, it was gone. Vanished. I had seen it, I was sure of it. But there was no sign of anyone now. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "It's nothing. You're just tired." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my pulse, but the unease lingered like a shadow in the pit of my stomach. As I stepped out of the car, my feet crunched against the gravel. The sound seemed louder now, more invasive. A soft rustle broke the silence, like something or someone moving behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. But the lot was still empty. The figure was gone. The air was still. I laughed nervously to myself. "Get it together," I muttered, but my voice sounded too thin, like it wasn't my own. I started walking toward the entrance of the building, my eyes scanning the lot as if expecting something to jump out at me. But as I passed by the row of parked cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My footsteps seemed too loud, too heavy, against the quiet backdrop of the night. And that smell, it was still there, clinging to the air like a warning. Then the sound came again. A rustle, a soft shuffling like someone dragging their feet. I froze. My eyes darted back to the dark stretch of the parking lot. The figure. It was there again. Not where I had seen it before, but further down, standing behind a silver sedan. A shadow in the darkness. This time it didn't vanish. It didn't move. It just stood there. I couldn't make out any details. The figure was indistinct, as if it were made of smoke, a shadow that had taken on shape. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely. My stomach churned. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The wind shifted, and I heard the sound again, clearer this time. A faint tapping, almost like a knock, coming from the direction of the figure. A chill crept up my spine. I walked faster, picking up the pace, trying to get to the entrance as quickly as possible. But with each step, the sense of being watched intensified. My heart was racing now, and the tapping, now unmistakable, followed me. It was getting closer, moving in rhythm with my footsteps. I turned a corner, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the lot. There was no one, just the silence. But then, just as I reached the door, I heard it. The soft whisper of a voice, too faint to make out. Go. The word echoed in my mind, even though no one had spoken it aloud. I spun around, but the lot was empty. The figure was gone. Everything was still. I pressed my hand against the door handle, breathing heavily, but my pulse was racing too fast to calm down. I turned the handle and stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The warmth of the building seemed to stifle the cold air of the parking lot, but it didn't ease the knot in my stomach. As I glanced back through the window, I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing in the darkness, watching, waiting. The tapping had stopped, but something told me I hadn't seen the last of it. The hours crawled by inside the building, but no amount of time could erase the feeling of unease that lingered. I tried to focus on my work, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me offering no comfort. My mind kept returning to that figure in the parking lot, the shape that vanished only to reappear waiting, as if it were tethered to the very air around me. I had tried to reason it away, but every corner I turned seemed to bring that unsettling image back into focus. I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was watching me even now. It was almost closing time and the office was empty. Just the sound of my keyboard tapping as I typed in my last notes of the day, but the deeper I dove into the task, the more the silence became unbearable. A low buzzing noise in the back of my mind began to pulse louder, like a constant hum, but each time I tried to identify it, it would stop. It was that same eerie feeling that had drawn me to the parking lot earlier, a feeling of something not quite right. I glanced at the clock just past midnight. The last bus had left hours ago, and the building was eerily quiet now. I stood up and stretched, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me. With one last, reluctant glance at my desk, I grabbed my coat and made my way to the exit. The parking lot was dead silent when I stepped outside. No sound except for the distant hum of the city behind me. I took a deep breath and stepped into the night, my shoes crunching on the gravel as I made my way to the car. The cold air bit at my skin, and I pulled my collar up, trying to block out the chill. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees in the distance, but the lot itself seemed strangely still. But as I walked towards my car, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again. The same sensation I had felt earlier of being watched was back. My footsteps faltered and my gaze flicked to the shadows. The figure. It was there again. Not where I had seen it last, but this time it was standing near the edge of the lot, partially obscured by the line of parked cars. I couldn't make out any details. It was simply a dark shape against the faint light of the street lamps. But it was unmistakably there. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood motionless, staring at the spot where the figure stood. I wanted to move to go back inside, but my legs felt frozen, as if the ground had claimed them. My mind raced, spinning in a frenzy of thoughts, but all I could do was stare at the shadowy shape. The figure didn't move. It stood completely still, as if it were waiting for something. For me, it felt wrong, too wrong. And then, without warning, it began to shift. The figure wasn't a single shape anymore. It started to elongate, twisting, as though it were made of smoke, stretching upward, growing into something much larger. My pulse raced as I took an involuntary step backward. The air grew colder. I wanted to scream to call for help, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure moved closer, the shadows warping and shifting around it like it was feeding off the darkness. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. But just as it came closer, something shifted again. A light. It flickered on, a harsh, bright light from the far end of the lot. It illuminated the figure for a split second, revealing a distortion. No, not a person at all, but a shape, like a silhouette stretched too far to be human. The outline of a face, its features blurred, almost as though it was made of shadow and fear itself. I stumbled back, barely catching myself against the side of my car. The light flickered again, casting a harsh glow over the parking lot, and when I looked up, the figure was gone. The air felt thick and wrong. It wasn't just the cold anymore, but something heavier. My breath was shallow, and I had to fight to steady my hands as I fumbled for my car keys. I had to leave. No. My heart thudded in my chest as I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. My fingers shook as I turned the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, but even as I sped out of the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following me. The shadows felt alive now, lurking in the corners of my vision, waiting for me to slip up. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the lot was empty. The streetlights flickered in the distance, and the city lay still, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. I had hoped that the further I drove, the more I could shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But no matter how far I went, the shadows in the corners of my mind didn't fade. They only grew sharper. I took the usual route home, the dark, empty streets blinking past in my headlights. The radio was playing quietly in the background, but I couldn't focus on the songs. My thoughts were still trapped in that parking lot, still on the shape that had moved between the cars, still on the chilling feeling of being hunted. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. I tried to convince myself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me. Maybe I had imagined it all, too much stress, too much work, too many late nights. My reflection in the rearview mirror was pale, my eyes red from lack of sleep, and I had no real answer for why I was so terrified. It was just a figure, a trick of the light, surely. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was real. It had to be. The way it moved. The way it was waiting for me. No amount of denial could erase the fact that something was following me. The tires hummed on the pavement as I turned a corner, and my headlights flashed across a familiar street, one that I passed every day on my way home. I slowed down instinctively, feeling a sudden urge to look around. Nothing. No figures hiding in the alleys, no strange shapes lurking in the shadows. Just empty streets, the occasional parked car, and the soft glow of street lamps. I shook my head, trying to push the thought from my mind. Maybe it had all been a panic-driven hallucination. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But that's when I saw it again. A figure, no a shadow. It was fleeting, moving between two parked cars on the side of the road, just far enough ahead for me to notice it from the corner of my eye. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles going white. My heart jumped in my chest. It had to be a person, a homeless person, maybe, or someone just walking by. But the movement, it wasn't right. The figure didn't move like a person. It glided just like the thing in the parking lot. Its edges blurred as though it was only half there. Something about it felt wrong, too wrong. I slammed my foot on the brake, bringing the car to an abrupt stop in the middle of the street. My headlights cast a wide beam in front of me, but the figure was gone. No sound, no movement, just the lonely hum of the car's engine and the cold night air pressing against the windows. I hesitated, my breath shallow. My eyes scanned the street, searching the darkness between the buildings, looking for any sign of the figure. Nothing. With a sigh of relief, I slowly released the brake and began to pull forward again, my hands still trembling slightly on the wheel. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. I couldn't shake the thought that it was still there, somewhere just out of sight. I tried to focus, to calm my breathing, and tell myself it was just nerves. But then a cold shiver ran down my spine. The hair on my neck stood on end. It was there again. This time I saw it more clearly. It was standing at the far end of the street, barely visible in the shadows of a dim streetlight. Its outline was distorted, too long, too thin. Its shape flickered in and out of focus like a glitch in reality itself. I froze. My fingers went numb and my heart raced as I looked at the figure. It didn't move at first, just stood there watching me. I wanted to call out to ask who they were, but the words never came. I just stared at the shadow, transfixed, as it began to drift closer, its form stretching unnaturally. Suddenly, the headlights of an oncoming car swept across the street, illuminating the figure in full light. For a split second, I saw its face. The face wasn't human. It was a blur of shadows, a sickly distortion that didn't belong to any living creature. I couldn't make out any features, just a void where a face should have been. The light from the oncoming car blinked off as it passed, and when it returned, the figure was gone. I blinked, still trying to process what I had just seen. My mind was racing, but all I could feel was the weight of an overwhelming terror gripping my chest. I couldn't stay here. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward, speeding through the quiet streets. But as I turned each corner, my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of movement, any sign that it was still following me. I tried to tell myself that it was just fear, just paranoia, but deep down I knew. It was real. It was out there, and I couldn't outrun it. The further I drove, the more the darkness around me seemed to press in. The streetlights flickered, their light flickering like a dying ember. The city felt too empty, too quiet. I was alone. But was I really? I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers were sore. Nothing. Or was there? A fleeting figure, almost imperceptible, flickered at the edge of the mirror. I blinked and it was gone. But I felt it. It was still out there. My breath came in shallow bursts as I turned yet another corner, the cold air from the open window hitting my face like a slap. The car's engine hummed steadily, but it felt like the silence inside was pressing in on me. My hands were slick with sweat, my grip on the wheel tightening with every passing second. I couldn't escape it. The figure, the thing that moved in and out of the shadows, that seemed to be following me. No matter how fast I drove, no matter how many turns I took, it was always just behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The street behind me was empty, just a stretch of pavement that disappeared into the darkness. But I could feel it. I could feel it watching me, waiting for the moment when I would slow down, when I would make a mistake. I was losing control, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it get closer. A sharp turn took me into another quiet neighborhood, the houses now barely visible in the dim light. The road curved gently, and as I rounded the bend, I saw the silhouette again. It wasn't far, just up ahead, standing in the middle of the street like it had been waiting for me to arrive. I slammed my foot on the brake. The tires squealed against the pavement, but I couldn't bring myself to stop completely. I kept the car rolling forward, slowing down, but not enough to stop. It stood there unmoving, like it was made of the same shadows that filled the night. For a moment I could have sworn it was watching me, its form too distorted to recognize as human. Come on, I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse as if pleading with the car to keep moving. The figure was too close now. I had no choice but to keep driving. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to look forward, to avoid the temptation of glancing back at the mirror. I couldn't risk it. I needed to get away. I pushed the accelerator down, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. But just as I thought I had outrun it, the car jerked violently, the wheels losing traction for a brief second before gripping the road again. Not now. Please not now, I whispered under my breath. The steering wheel trembled in my hands as I fought to regain control. And then in that split second of chaos, I saw it again. The thing was closer now, too close. It had moved. No, it had appeared closer. It was standing on the sidewalk just beside the street lamp, its shape barely visible against the glow of the light. But I could see enough. The unnatural way it moved, how it seemed to flicker and distort like it wasn't fully there, was impossible to ignore. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, a sharp pain that made it hard to breathe. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't just some trick of the mind. This thing, it was real. It was following me, and it wasn't going to stop. Please just let me get home, I whispered to myself, feeling the tears beginning to sting the back of my eyes. But the moment I looked back at the rearview mirror, I saw it again. The thing, it wasn't behind me this time. No, it was in the mirror right there, standing in the back seat. I couldn't even tell how long it had been there. Its face, or what I assumed to be a face, was too blurry to focus on. But I could feel its presence, an overwhelming, suffocating force. I screamed and slammed my foot down on the brake, the car jerking forward again. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I yanked the wheel, turning sharply into another alleyway. But there was no escape. The streetlights blinked out as I moved further into the darkness, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the deafening silence of the night. I couldn't look back. I couldn't, but my mind was screaming at me to check the rearview mirror again, to confirm that it wasn't there. But I did look. It was gone, just like that. The back seat was empty. I could see the shadows stretched along the floor of the car, but there was no figure. Nothing. I thought I'd escaped it. I thought I had outrun it for good. But the weight in the air didn't lift. The sense of being watched, the feeling of being followed, was still there, hanging over me like a storm cloud. I took a deep breath and turned down another dark street. The streetlights flickered above, but I didn't care. I didn't feel safe. I was still waiting for it to come back. A distant sound, soft but unmistakable, reached my ears. It was a tap, faint at first, like a quiet knock against the window. I froze. The tapping grew louder, closer. It was coming from the back of the car. I couldn't help myself. I turned around. It was standing there, pressed against the window. Its face was clearer now, more defined than ever before. But it wasn't a face. It was a blur of shadows, an ever-shifting mask that distorted with every movement. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I reached for the door handle, but it was too late. The tapping stopped. The figure was gone, but I knew it wasn't gone for good. It was still here, still waiting, still following, and no matter where I drove, it would always be there. I had never believed in monsters, at least not in the way people often talked about them. No creatures with claws or fangs, no ghosts that could reach out and touch you. But as the car hummed down the road, my grip tightening with every passing mile, I realized I had been wrong. The thing wasn't something I could explain away with logic. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was something else. Something I couldn't put my finger on, but I could feel in my bones. It was here in the back of my car, lingering just beyond my reach. Every turn I made felt like I was running in circles, the streets growing more unfamiliar with each passing minute. The headlights flickered in the rearview mirror, and for a moment I almost thought I saw it, just standing there waiting. I pushed the pedal down harder, but no matter how fast I drove, it stayed right there. The tapping on the window hadn't stopped. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like it was testing me, playing with me to see how long I could last. The streets I was passing seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence in the car was unbearable. The only sound was that tapping, steady, rhythmic, and too close. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my foot on the brake, bringing the car to a screeching halt. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat soaking through my clothes. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the darkness outside the car. The windows were fogged up, but I could still see the outline of something, or someone, standing next to my door. A figure tall and unnaturally still, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence pressing against the car, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. The tapping on the window stopped. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, without warning, the figure reached out. Its hand pressed against the glass, too large, too distorted to be human. It didn't move like a normal hand. It stretched as if the skin was made of something elastic, like it could reach right through the glass and grab me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Suddenly the air inside the car felt thick, suffocating. I fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape, but my hands were shaking too badly to grip it. The figure was still there, its hand slowly moving up the window, dragging a trail of something wet and dark across the glass. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in real time, like everything around me was slipping into a world that didn't make sense anymore. The tapping began again, louder now, as if the figure was growing more impatient. Then, without warning, the car lurched forward. I hadn't touched the accelerator. The figure outside seemed to be pulling me forward, as if it had some invisible grip on the car, forcing me to move. The engine roared to life, and I had no choice but to let it carry me. The streets blurred around me, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but I was no longer in control. I was being taken. The tapping came again, louder, more frantic now, as if the thing was trying to make contact. It was no longer just a shadow on the window. It was pressing itself against the glass, its face, if you could even call it that, contorted in a grotesque way. It had no features, no real eyes or mouth, just a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to pulsate with life. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but every part of me was paralyzed. I could feel it, though, feel its cold presence seeping through the cracks in the car, infecting everything around me. I looked down at the dashboard. The speedometer was climbing. Too fast. The needle was nearly in the red zone, and yet I couldn't stop it. I slammed my foot on the brake again, but the car wouldn't respond. It was like the road itself had become a trap. The tapping on the window came faster now, a series of sharp, rapid knocks. The figure's hand was still there, now more like a claw, scraping against the glass. It wasn't human, it wasn't anything I had ever seen. And then it spoke. The voice, if you could even call it that, was a soundless whisper that echoed in my mind, an overwhelming presence that filled every corner of my brain. "You can't escape," it said. My heart stopped. The words weren't coming from the outside, they were inside my head. I could feel them, thick and suffocating, swirling in my thoughts like a dark fog. "You will see it through," the voice whispered again, closer now. So close I could feel it vibrating through my skull. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I was trapped in my own mind, trapped in the car, trapped in the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The road ahead was disappearing. The car was speeding down a tunnel now, a never-ending stretch of asphalt and empty darkness, and no matter how much I tried to turn the wheel or hit the brakes, nothing worked. I was being pulled in, and there was no way out. And then the voice spoke one last time, its words cutting through me like a blade. "You are already gone." The car lurched forward into the void, and the world outside the windows collapsed into darkness. And in that moment, I knew it was over. There was no escape, no safety, only the thing that had been following me all along. And it had won. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.